Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third seminar in the 2024 Digital Classicist London series. This seminar is both going out live, so those of you who are watching it right now on the afternoon of July 12th can interact with us using the live chat feature to the right of the video or below the video on YouTube. Feel free to say hi in the chat there now if you like. It's always nice for us to know who's there. We'll also be very, very keen to get your questions and comments and contributions later in the video. If you're watching this later, then you can't interact with us live, but I think we'd probably be happy for you to get in touch at some point, and we're very glad you're here watching anyway. So on to today's topic. We're very pleased to have Professor Anna Conser, who's an assistant professor of classics at the University of Cincinnati, who's going to talk to us today about pitch accents as melodic data in ancient Greek texts. I think over to you, Anna.
All right, great. Thanks. Can you start at the screen share? Perfect, thank you. So before I get started, I will, of course, thank Gabby and Katie for their work in organizing not just this talk, but this whole series, which I've checked out a lot of the videos, and it's a great asset for people trying to figure out this area, which can be sort of tricky to figure out the scope of what digital projects might be including. So what I'm going to present today is a short overview of my current digital project, which focuses on, as Gabby said, on the patterning of pitch accents just in the lyrics of Greek tragedy. Now, because this topic might sound a little bit dry, I want to emphasize that my interest in pitch accents grew out of practical questions that arose when I was working on performances staged with music. So for those of you who might not think of tragedy this way, it's important to keep in mind that it was musical theater, that poets like Aeschylus and Sophocles were not just playwrights, but composers as well, and that music was almost certainly an integral part of how they were communicating meaning in their plays. So from this perspective, any information we can obtain about a tragedy's musical design is immensely valuable as a tool for interpretation in particular. So from this perspective, I view pitch accent patterns as a very exciting topic, and I hope in my talk today to maybe convince you a little bit of that as well. So the talk today is going to fall into four main sections. First, I'd like to give you a little background on the historical association of pitch accent and music that gives a basis for the digital methods that I'm applying to my software. Second, I'll give you a short overview of the database I've created for Tragic Lyric, and then the Python modules that I've created to process that data according to the pitch accents and the meter and get some musical data out of it. Third, I'll share some of my preliminary findings. This includes both the diachronic picture, such as I have it at the moment, as well as a statistic about circumflex accents that I think is particularly interpretively relevant. I'll close with a software demonstration. We can kind of poke around with my software. I'll run a few things, see if we can find some patterns that are worthy of meaningful interpretation. And then last, I just want to raise a few questions and think about the applications for this. And this will lead into the Q&A, where I hope we can get some discussion going of how this might be used in the future. And I'll emphasize, since I know some of you might be watching later, that you should feel free to email me. I'm happy to run text through my software. It takes me very little time to do so. And also to get your feedback. If you have thoughts on this project or how it could be shaped in the future, that'd be extremely helpful. All right, moving forward then. I should start by giving everyone some background on tragic odes in general, but particularly why pitch accents might give us insight on their musical design. So while the melodies of Greek tragedy were not preserved in the textual tradition, a number of Hellenistic songs found in inscriptions, like the one we see here, and in papyri, do include music notation for their melodic settings. Here you can see lyrics with little letters written above each syllable that record what note that is supposed to be sung to. So in these songs, the sound of the words is often reflected in the sung melody. Rhythmically, as you might be familiar with, the alternation of long and short syllables is reflected in the duration of the sung notes. Melodically, the rises and falls of the pitch accents are also reflected in the rises and falls of the melody. Based on the songs that survive, we can identify three main principles for coordinating the sung melody with the natural intonation of the pitch accents. I'll just say that there are a number of additional tendencies, and I'm happy to share some bibliography on that. It gets really nitty-gritty, but these three principles are the most widely and consistently applied across the songs that survive. So first, we can see that within each word, the melody often rises before the accent and then falls after it. For example, if we take the word apopheretai and set it to music, one possible melodization that follows these principles might be to sing apopheretai with the highest note appearing on the accented syllable. This rule, what some people would call the pitch height rule, applies to all types of accents, whether they're acute, grave, or circumflex. But for graves and circumflexes, there are additional principles which presumably reflect the way that these accents were pronounced differently from acutes in normal speech. So when a word ends with a grave accent, that final syllable with the grave accent will have the highest note within its word. But then, after that word ends, the melody doesn't fall. It generally continues to rise or repeat the same note until we reach the next word's accent. So, for example, the phrase ho pater apopheretai might be sung as ho pater apopheretai. In this sense, grave accented words might be called melodically proclitic, in that they form a single melodic arc with the word that follows. In the case of circumflex accents, the accented syllable will again be the highest syllable within its word, but it is often ornamented with a small melodic embellishment. The first half of the syllable receives the melodic peak, and the second half of that accented syllable is sung on a lower note. Thus, for example, Gaia might be sung with three notes overall, with that circumflex rendered with what we might call a melism, the division of two notes in a falling sequence. Gaia, for example, Gaia, three notes. In presenting these three principles, I've put them in their strongest form as guidelines for precisely matching accent and melody. In practice, however, ancient composers merely sought non-contradiction. That is to say, the melody should not move contrary to the intonational contour of the accents, but any intonational contour can be melodically flattened into a repetition of the same note. Thus, for example, when singing the phrase ho pater apopheretai, it would be fine to sing everything on the same note, ho pater apopheretai, or even with some of the contours flattened, ho pater apopheretai. But what would sound wrong in this instance is to sing the phrase in a way that moves contrary to the accents. For example, ho pater apopheretai. Now, that might not sound too different to our ears because we're not used to hearing pitch accents enunciated melodically, but that would sound really wrong, or at least the ancient text setting that does survive suggests that that intonation would be avoided melodically because it would sound wrong. If we keep this in mind, we can think about repeated notes as being especially important because they give the composer more flexibility as they're coordinating words and music. Let's turn now to Greek tragedy in particular. In tragic odes, the chorus's lyrics are generally arranged in paired stanzas. That is to say, a strophe followed by its responding antistrophe. These lyric stanzas share the same meter in our received texts, and the ancient sources that comment on musical design, particularly Dionysius of Halicarnassus, tell us that these stanzas would have originally been performed using the same melody. This melodic repetition creates an opportunity for us today to investigate the coordination of accent and melody in tragic songs. If two lyric stanzas were accentually coordinated with the same repeated melody, we would expect their accentual contours to show some signs of coordination. To explain what this looks like, let's look at the final lyrics of the final stanza of the Agamemnon Parados. In the strophe, the chorus sings that Iphigenia, quote, dearly honored the Paian, Paiona philos etima. In the responding lyrics of the antistrophe, the chorus ends the song with an inscrutable reference to the bulwark who guards the land alone. Gaias monofruron herkos. These lines are mostly compatible in their accentual melodies, with the exception of the change between the first and second notes. In the strophe, we might expect a rise to the accent on paiona, but the antistrophe calls for a melodic motion in the opposite direction, for the melody to fall after the acute accent at the beginning of Gaias. It's important to remember, however, that both words would be considered compatible if the melody had a repetition of the same note. Using the same melody for both lines, we might sing, for example, Paiona philos etima for the strophe, and then using that same melody for the antistrophe, Gaias monofroron herkos. Here, the overall compatibility of the accentual contours is mostly facilitated by those precisely matching accents, which fall on the same metrical positions in both stanzas. In some other cases, however, the contours can be compatible even when the accents don't align so precisely. Take, for example, the first line of this same strophe-antistrophe pair. In the strophe, the chorus here is continuing their narration of the sacrifice of Iphigenia, saying that the men gagged Iphigenia, quote, with the force and voiceless power of bits. Biai kalinon an audo mene. In the antistrophe, they sing of their own silence in this same metrical position, saying that they did not see what happened next and that they will not speak of it. Tad enthen ut eidon ut en epo. In the first part of this line, the accents don't respond, but it would still be possible to sing both lyrics with the same melody while only repeating one note. Let me check which one it is. There we go. Biai kalinon tadem thenuted. So the word breaks here are a key part of allowing these two phrases to respond melodically. In the antistrophe lyric, the word enthen calls for a melodic fall after that acute accent. In the strophe, there's a word break in this same position, so the lyrics of the strophe can still fit with that same melodic contour as in the antistrophe. Biai kalinon taden thenuted. What this shows, and what's really important to take away here, is that even when the accents don't precisely align, the intonational contours can still be compatible. they can still match that same melody, even without a repeated note. Before introducing my database, I should give a little background on the impetus for taking such a data-driven approach in my assessment of accents. For most of the last century, the leading scholars on ancient music were extremely firm in the belief that tragic song could not have respected accent. And this is because the accents of strophes and antistrophes don't precisely respond the way that metrical responsion is quite consistent, at least in our edited texts. But as I just demonstrated, precise alignment is not actually an essential part of creating compatibility in the contours because of word breaks and melodic repetitions, which can give the poet considerable flexibility in choosing two lyrics that can still match the same melody. In addition to this logical, maybe correction, if I can put it that way, I felt as a lowly PhD student who was facing the likes of A.M. Dale and L.M. West that it might be best to have some substantial data supporting my hypothesis. And I didn't really know how to code in Python at this point, but I knew enough about coding to know that this was something that could be handled algorithmically, that it is a rules-based process, and that I should be able to put through a large quantity of texts and get statistics for how the accents are aligning. So the database itself that I've made is quite simple. I've tried to keep the text as unedited as I can and to put most of the processing onto the algorithms. So for each play, I created a CSV spreadsheet, like you see here, with the OCT text copy-pasted into paired cells. For most of the plays, I've also manually added scansion, as well as some notes on where I've made technical changes to the text. The excerpt that I'm showing here is the opening stanza pair of the Agamemnon Parados, maybe something familiar to more in my audience. And you can see here the small interventions that I've made into the text. So in the first line, you can see I'm marking a resolution in the meter with a vertical line, or maybe you would call it a pipe. And this mark in the text cues my software to process the two syllables on either side as a single metrical position, kind of a conjoined syllable. A resolution. Additionally, as you can see in the final line of this first stanza, I use an @ sign at the end of the line to mark lines that should be excluded from my processing. In this case, this is a precisely repeated refrain, and I felt that it'd be unfair to include this because it's going to create a higher level of accentual responsion, even though it just has to do with the repeating of the exact same wording. So other than these interventions, my software works with the information that's already encoded in the text itself. This can include marks handling marking corruption, but also, of course, most importantly, the accents themselves, which are helpfully encoded in the textual tradition. To handle the processing of the text, I've created Python modules that complete various tasks at different levels. So first, they import data from the CSV files and organize it as interconnected Python objects using classes I've made to reflect the structuring of the text at various levels, ranging from the syllable all the way up to an author's whole corpus. As the text of these responding stanzas is input and processed, it's split into syllables, algorithmically, again, splitting the text up according to the same rules we would follow in doing metrical scansion or looking at the division of sound patterning. And then these syllables are aligned by their metrical position. So responding syllables are identified, and then they can be compared down the line. Each of the syllables is also tagged with its meter and its accentual contours, the contours it has in both stanzas. And these are algorithmically extracted based on the syllable's position relative to the word accent. So pre-accentual syllables will be presumed to be followed by a rise. Post-accentual syllables, our melody should be falling. And then it also, of course, looks at the type of accent that is used, marking circumflexes as such, making graves followed by a rise or a repeat. This whole process is handled by an algorithm that applies the three principles that I discussed earlier, but it also incorporates some other linguistic factors, such as enclitics and proclitics, which in the surviving musical melodies are typically treated as part of the host word. So they're part of that same melodic arc rather than functioning independently. So after all that's done, my software can compare the accentual contours of the responding syllables and can display the results in various formats. I'll show the raw outputs for this as part of the demo at the end, but for now, I'll show you some of the big picture results that this has developed. So my current database includes all of the responding stanzas in Aeschylus and Sophocles' complete plays, as well as 7 representative plays by Euripides. In considering the data for these plays, the metric I've investigated most thoroughly at this point is the rate of compatible syllables. That is to say, the percentage of metrical positions where the strophe and the antistrophe lyrics allow for a melodic movement in the same direction. As I say, they're compatible in the direction of melodic movement. For all 3 authors, this rate is over 80%, meaning that over 80% of syllables could have the same melodic movement in both stanzas, while also complementing the wording. For my initial study, which focused only on Aeschylus, I compared the tragic data with various control groups and conducted a binomial test of significance. The control groups, just for reference, included prose that I put into paired stanzas, somewhat arbitrarily of the same number of syllables, as well as metrically responding sections of poetry, using both iambic trimeter, again, sections chosen to respond, and anapestic dimeters of various sizes made to respond perfectly. Now, the results of this test were extremely significant, but what I find more compelling is actually to compare this accentual data with the melodic patternings in the real ancient songs that survive. So here's some statistics for those. In these songs that are annotated on papyri and inscriptions, and a few that come down in the manuscript tradition, the average rate of melodic note changes is lower than what would be demanded for Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. It's just 78%. And in the other 22% of syllables, the note is followed by a repetition of that same note. Practically, this means that tragic odes could have easily followed the same principles for coordinating accent and melody as the later songs that survive, provided that the rate of repetitions was comparable to what we see in these later Hellenistic songs. Now, most scholars agree that these later songs were likely to have been more melodically elaborate than their classical predecessors, such that this comparison is a real solid possibility. It seems quite, at the very least, quite possible that Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides could have been following these same principles, and likely that they were, based on how well the accents tend to correspond. I'm also very interested in looking at the larger diachronic trends in accent responsion. This graph is an initial attempt at visualizing changes over time, though I should acknowledge that the dates for many of these plays are difficult to pin down, and this is an area where I certainly need to go deeper in pinning down exactly when to date these plays. But the relative chronology is a little bit more solid in many places. And based on that, we can look at a few general trends. Particularly in the early plays of Aeschylus and possibly Sophocles as well, we can see a slow increase in accentual responsion, most likely suggesting an increase in the rate of note changes. Notably, several ancient authors who comment on the musical history of this same period mention an increase in melodic movement as one of the key developments. And this would appear to substantiate my hypothesis that increasing accentual responsion could indicate increasing melodic liveliness, that is to say, a decrease in melodic repetitions. In the late 5th century, however, you'll notice that things get a bit more chaotic, with accentual responsion appearing to lower overall. While I haven't explored these later texts in depth yet, I might propose that this shift is due in part to a limitation inherent in my approach. In the later music of Euripides, as well as in Sophocles' Philoctetes, a larger portion of the play's songs are astrophic, which is to say they are through composed without musical repetition. Because these songs don't feature responding stanzas, they are necessarily excluded from my database. And I have a sneaking suspicion that excluding these fabulous musical climaxes has an effect on how we perceive them, right? It makes their overall rate of melodic movement look much lower than it would be in performance if we included those musical climaxes. An example of this shift within plays might be the data here for the Oresteia, where you can see that musical liveliness varies across the trilogy, and that the musical climaxes of Coephae and Eumenides are much more, well, at least they have higher accentual responsion, suggesting more lively melodies than we see in the maybe slower open of Agamemnon and the many sort of epic stanzas of its opening parados. Overall, then, my big takeaway from this chart, if we're going to think about the interpretive value of accentual data, is the idea that stanzas with a lower rate of accentual responsion might suggest a more archaic style of performance. This is clearest in the background of Aeschylus's plays, but you can also see it in early Sophocles. And while I would hypothesize that this increase in accentual responsion is tied to an increase in melodic movement, placing restrictions on the melody, or placing restrictions on the wording and making them better align, it really could be any performed phenomenon. In a way, what's key here is the correlation of low accentual responsion with earlier performance styles. That itself is a little bit more solid, even if we have to speculate about the performative means that connects those two. Another trend I've noticed is an imbalance in the placement of circumflex accents. I've looked at this most closely in Aeschylus and found that across all of his responding stanza pairs, on average, there are 27% more circumflex accents in the second stanza than there are in the first. So in the antistrophe rather than in the strophe. This is true even though these stanzas are metrically identical and they appear side by side in works by the same author. So these are stylistically and even metrically identical. The only difference is musical sequence, the sequence in which they appear for the audience. To me, this division between strophes and antistrophes suggests that these small melodic flourishes associated with circumflex accents, that little melismatic embellishment, might be considered an ornamental variation, which is then added as a way to give new interest in the second stanza when the same music is repeated a second time. Thinking in terms of interpretive value, then, this would suggest that circumflex accents might be particularly interesting as an index of musical embellishment. Now, to give an example of how this might work in practice, I'll share a little bit of a case study from a piece I recently published in Abritta, which examines the musical patterning of accents in Sophocles' Trachiniae. In the final scene of this play, Heracles, the long-awaited hero, returns at last from his labors. But contrary to what we might expect of this heroic entrance, Heracles is carried in moaning and actually singing as he slowly dies from his wife's flesh-burning love potion. In this scene, he sings a long monody complaining about his fiery disease. And as you can see in this chart, his song, marked here as the monody, is exceptionally dense in circumflex accents. Now, an important bit of context in interpreting this melismatic embellishment in this particular song is the fact that in ancient music, the wavering melodies caused by circumflex accents are sometimes used to illustrate particularly the flickering of flames. So in my interpretation of this passage, I argue that Heracles' anguished music creates a similar effect, allowing him to illustrate musically, sonically, the pain of the poison, which he describes in the lyrics as burning his flesh. I'll also note that when Heracles sings part of this monody in dactylic hexameter, he uses an especially high rate of circumflex accents, including if we compare it to kind of the baseline set by Homeric versions of this meter. This melismatic distortion of a traditional epic meter, I would argue, should be seen as an apt musical metaphor for the narrative position that Heracles finds himself. We have an epic hero with a history of being represented in dactylic hexameter, who has now been degraded into this new, more painfully melodic genre. It's part of his effeminization in this scene, if you will. So I'll leave it there for thinking about this play, but you can check out my piece in Arethusa and let me know if you have any thoughts on that. It's one of my first kind of attempts to take this method and really see what it can do interpretively, which is what I think the main aim I have is for the long run. But to think a little bit more about how this can be applied, let's maybe do a little bit of live exploration. And at this point, I'd be very glad if people want to jump in, interrupt. This can be a little bit more interactive if anyone's interested in that. I'm just going to give a tour of what my software can do, and we can play with it. I'll see what we find as we're going through. Let me switch my screen share. No, that's not what I want. There we go. Everybody can see that all right?
Yep.
Great, perfect. All right. So this is, I just put together a Jupyter notebook rather than having to do it manually. This way it's all pre-set up. And this is actually posted on my GitHub. I'll have a link to that at the end. So if people want to try playing with this, it makes it a little bit easier, fixes some of the in-house decisions that I've made along the way. So here at the top, we have an outline of the plays that are included in my database. This is important just for reference because I have to currently access individual plays by slicing them out of lists. They're just included as a list of plays for each author. So this is for easy reference. You can see here also the control databases are there for consideration. So the first step I'm going to do here is just to load the software for class author, which kind of allows you to load a whole author and look at all of the plays individually. I find this more convenient than loading individual plays for the most part. So here I'm going to load Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and this will pull in all of their plays from all of their CSV files. All right, it's all just text, so it's really fast. So that's done. And then I wanted to go through and kind of think about the different statistics that my software can create. Currently, for the display function, I have it show 3 different metrics that I find useful for thinking about a stanza's musical design. The first is compatible syllables. That's what I was discussing earlier, the measure of the percentage of syllables where the melody could move in both stanzas in the same direction. So this is the inverse of the conflicts between strophe and antistrophe. Second, we have matched accents. So this is specifically looking at matched accentual peaks. A grave accent isn't actually a peak, right? The melody continues to rise into the next stanza. So this only includes acutes and circumflexes, places where the melody hits its high point and then begins to descend, which is, of course, maybe a little bit more meaningful as we're thinking about really kind of punching the words, right? If you really want to be punching the words, you want to have that matched peak, a matched fall as well. And then third, we have matched circumflexes. I will say I've been doing a little bit less with this over time since I've discovered that circumflexes often occur in one stanza or the other without responding. I've moved toward looking at the overall rate of circumflexes in a stanza, but I haven't yet built that into the native matched, into the display function. So let's give it a shot. Let's run Aeschylus here. So if we do Aeschylus.display, here we go. What it will print is the total overall across all of the plays of Aeschylus. And then it will also provide the statistics for each of the plays individually. What's nice about having all of this done from the raw text is that if I want to change the text or if I find errors in the OCT, and I will say I have found a few in the digital OCTs, it does allow me to go in, fix that, and immediately rerun the stats. It's always working with the newest database. Let's keep moving along here then. So if I want to look at an individual play, what I find most convenient is typically just to slice it out of the author as a whole. So if I want to, I can identify Agamemnon as, if we look at the plays of Aeschylus, it's the 4th play, which is to say index 3, because 0 is included. And then if I do Agamemnon.display, it's going to give us that same data, but only looking at the play itself and the stanzas within it. So here we can see overall, Agamemnon has 80.3% compatible syllables, and we can look at each of the individual stanza pairs. So this is the first song, the Parados, and it has a very large number of stanzas within it, but I can see the tendencies in between those. This is one way that I do display. What's more useful for making graphs and things, however, is I can also export it as a CSV file that I can then use for graphing. I haven't done graphing inside yet because it's not a priority for me yet. But I think at some point that would be helpful for making this more accessible for others to use. Now let's say we're looking at this overall data for Agamemnon. We're maybe thinking about doing an analysis of the Agamemnon Parados, which is one of the songs that I've looked at in more detail. If I'm going through, I can see that it starts out with extremely low responsion compared to the average, right? These are almost the same as what we would find in control groups, possibly suggesting a very archaic style of song, something that's evoking that epic tradition potentially, or something that's simply more monotonous, that's just continuing to sing the same note with greater frequency. Here in the gamma pair, this is part of the hymn to Zeus. We can see an abrupt shift, a big rise. That suggests that something is going on different in the music of this ode, of this stanza pair compared to what came before. And metrically, it's the same kind of meters that we get in the beta pair. So it's something that's just different in the melodization. That's true both for the compatible syllables, but also here in the precisely matched syllables is also quite high. So now let's say my curiosity is piqued. So what I can do is I can then slice among the pairs in Agamemnon and display just that one stanza pair. So this is parados gamma. When you display an individual pair, it'll give us the strophe and antistrophe text with the meter. In this case, this is automatically processed meter. I haven't entered manual meter for Agamemnon, but it typically gives me a good enough sense that I can actually see the meter pretty well. Almost all of the X's, which are unknowns, indicate short syllables. I'm just very conservative in not misidentifying syllables to the extent possible. And then here you can see the accentual scansion. So we've got a long melodic rise suggested by this first line, followed by a fall on this key word. Odo Santa, Zeus is the one who sets men on their road. And Agamemnon is the presbus, the old man leader of the Achaean army. So we're maybe getting a comparison musically, this key rise bringing us up to that high point of a comparison implied by the music between Zeus as a leader who's setting people on the road and maybe Agamemnon as a leader who's trying to take his troops off. So Zeus here sets a musical template, which then Agamemnon is trying to follow musically using that same melody. So, I could keep picking through. This is what I'll kind of do, go through, see what I can find, try and find meaning in the responsion of ideas and in how they're musically rendered. But definitely don't want to take time to go through a whole stanza. Also highlight that there's various other things that are built in along the way. So you can look at the tags that are associated with every syllable in a stanza. So here that's not beautifully designed as an output. It's just a list of lists. And each one of these sublists gives us all of the tags associated with that syllable in either stanza. So proclitics are marked, but then also capitalized words, syllables, I should say, that fall within a capitalized word. There's some sign that in ancient music, proper names were handled differently. And again, that's something that is present in our edited text to some extent. So I've included that so that I can run separate statistics on capitalized and uncapitalized words. I think we're getting kind of toward the end of my time. So maybe I'll not take a look at the Medea data here. I think we've seen enough of an example, and I'd rather make sure we have lots of time for the Q&A, but this is something, you can always check it out. It's all on GitHub. As I said, you can see if you find it interesting or useful. Now let's see. Let me go back here. There we go. So I'll close by just saying a little bit about kind of the future applications and some of the decisions that I am thinking through as I'm continuing to work on this project and trying to, get it both finalized in a way that can be shared with others, but also just applied systematically in my own interpretive publications. So one big question I'm facing is what to exclude from my statistics. Currently, I exclude any line that shows signs of textual corruption. This includes things that are daggered. If there's any daggered text in a line, that whole line is just excluded statistically. If there's a lacuna of more than a syllable or a lacuna that hasn't been supplemented by an editor, that gets excised. It's considered too corrupt to be secure. I'm also taking out precisely repeated refrains. And then one of the things that I find more challenging is thinking about iambic trimeter within stanzas. It's unclear whether these were sung or recited. There's actually some exciting work being done in this area, so hopefully that will come along and I can lean on the musical scholars who are investigating that question. The other kind of big challenge for me is thinking about which statistics should be put in the foreground of my analyses. So today I was showing you compatible syllables, which is to say the inverse of conflicts. I find this perhaps the most meaningful in terms of thinking about a stanza's overall musical design, how much melodic movement was there. But I'm also tempted by the statistic looking at precise accentual matches, this moment when you have an accentual peak in the same place in both stanzas, which I think would create a stronger bond between the melody and the words and kind of pull the words of the two stanzas a little closer together. It's more of a jingle than just thinking about the overall musical design. Then thinking about the potential applications, currently, of course, my main attraction is to look at song lyrics across tragedy. There are plenty of tragedies to look at, but then that can be extended to comedy easily, but also other lyric genres that feature metrical responsion. And I'll highlight here that while my current project, I'm only looking at strophes and antistrophes, I actually built the software so that it could handle any number of stanzas. So here you can see the very first line of Sappho 1, but with all of its responding iterations. Now, when you have 7 stanzas, it's a lot harder to get any kind of accentual alignment. And we might think performatively that it's more likely that you would have variations across the stanzas so that it didn't get so monotonous. But all the same, you can kind of see some elements pointing to a core of this stanza's musical design. We do have these responding points where there's a rise, especially in the second half of the line, that shows that there might be something to see here. It's certainly an area that I think deserves further work somewhere down the line. Other applications I've been thinking about are the pitch patterning of prose. So this wouldn't use a lot of the software that I've created, for handling strophes and antistrophes in particular, but just the basic algorithm for looking at where the intonation rises and falls has the potential to be applied, particularly maybe in oratory, something that has a more performative element. But for thinking about whether we get clausuli that are melodic as well as rhythmic would be something I'd be curious to learn more about. And this is kind of a bigger question, but not something that I've particularly looked at, but is looking at the historical data related to intonation, that we might be able to do some comparative work or thinking about, big picture patterns from a linguistic perspective. And of course, I'd be curious to hear what other ideas you have. And with that, I'll turn it over to the Q&A. And you'll see here both, you can go to my GitHub page where you can, try playing with this software if that's something that you've got the technical know-how to do. But also, please feel free to reach out to me, whether by email, my email's there, or some kind of social medium on Twitter, Blue Sky, things like that. I'd love to start conversations about this work because, as you might know, many digital projects happen in a vacuum, and it's always nice to hear how people think this might be useful. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Anna. That was great. A really exciting overview. I was also, this is probably a requirement among people who study ancient music, but certainly in conversations I've had about meter and pitch and all that sort of thing, actually someone who's able to sing is just a game changer in terms of this conversation. So congratulations for the whole thing. It was also, a game changer not only in that you could make the case, but actually things that I would not have understood from the terminology, I understood from your demonstration. As someone who also knows nothing about music, so I was very impressed by that. So thank you.
Thank you. I might amend that to willing to sing, but willing to sing is the major part of it. And if you can get a chorus to sing and dance these things, that is even more of a demonstration.
Yeah. I stand by able. I used to, when I taught ancient Greek, I used to insist on the correct use of accentuation, which is not something that is typical in studying Greek in the UK. And my students would often respond by saying, "We will, we will learn accents when you learn to sing." And therefore never. Anyway.
Yeah, one thing that's sort of interesting is that our pronunciation of pitch accents is actually largely based on these sources. So it's how they're set melodically. So it might seem a little strange to go through speech and then to song, but really it's actually more solid to be using this data for reconstructing melodies than it is for using it to reconstruct speech. We're just sort of assuming the analysis actually goes in the opposite direction from a scholarly perspective. How they sing gives us some insight on how they might have spoken.
So if anyone who's watching live wants to ask any questions, there is a live chat feature. Please feel free to use that. I'm aware that some of the people who are watching live are watching with a slight delay, so we may get some questions popping up in a few minutes. But please feel free to do that whenever you get to this point. Did we have anything we wanted to bring up in the first instance?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Oh, sorry.
I mean, I can. I was wondering, so just sort of very factual question from one of the early points you made about the few texts we have that actually have musical notation, which you said were mostly inscriptions of papyri, and there were fragments at any rate.
Yeah, there's some that come through the manuscript tradition as well. Those tend to be a little bit later. The earliest ones.
Yeah. Yeah, and through the manuscript tradition, it's probably a little bit harder to know how much of that musical information is ancient, I guess. I mean, is ancient as opposed to slightly potential for emendation of either notation or.
Possibly. I will admit that the later songs I've looked at in less detail. I've relied on the secondary scholarship for that. But my impression is that there wasn't much attention paid to the notation. I mean, it was copied. One might argue that maybe it was copied less well, but the interpretation of the melodic notation requires, it's not intuitive. You just see these strange symbols written above each syllable, and then you have to go to some of the ancient handbooks that are discussing music theory and actually look at how they're describing string tunings and sort of to determine what these intervals are and what exactly is meant by the notation. So I think there's some possibility that those are solid. But the earliest things, and particularly the one that I work with the most closely, is the Delphic hymns that are inscribed on the Athenian treasury in Delphi. Because those are extremely consistent, perhaps almost pedantic in coordinating words and melody. Some people have hypothesized it might be like an attempt to do a more archaizing style in a period when we might be moving away from the pitch accent. But it's kind of the obsessive application that gives you the gold standard for many of these principles. But then you see them in others as well.
Do we think those sorts of texts were meant to be used as instructions for the people performing? I mean, presumably they weren't standing in front of the inscription reading it, but I mean, they could have been a source to be copied. Would people have been looking at those symbols as they sung in the way that people look at sheet music?
I would say presumably not for a choral performance, only because music notation seems to have been especially early on, an extremely niche technical skill. Whereas the general public probably wouldn't be interested in doing that. It depends on what kind of a chorus we're talking about, and I'm not sure exactly how that chorus was formed. If I'm thinking about, a citizen chorus, I'm not sure if reading music notation would have been one of the skills. You'd probably teach it, the way a chorus gets trained today. You play it on the piano or play it on the aulos, probably, have someone sing it and then have them sing it back, teach it orally rather than via the textual tradition. Why they chose to put music notation on the exterior of a building, one must assume it's more either commemorative of the event, but also maybe, I don't know. I mean, I would imagine people coming up who do know. You'd have tourists. Delphi has a lot of people coming from all over who could, even after the fact, if you're a technician, you could have your little recreation of that historic moment by reading the text, singing the notes, and performing it as best you are able to.
So sorry, I mean, I was enjoying all of those details, but the question I was going to ask was are any of those texts that have musical notation in either the fragments or the handbooks fragments of the same texts that you're particularly interested in, fragments of tragedy, for example, turning up in any of those places that you can then compare side by side with your interpretation?
Yeah, so we do have the one much beloved example is there are a few lines of an antistrophe from Euripides' Orestes, so one of his quite late plays. That there's a papyrus that's, I think, 200 years after his death. So quite a span of time there that has melodic notation. It's debated whether or not the melody that's written there would be original. We also have papyri from this period that are iambic trimeters from tragedy that are set to music as though they were originally musical. Because it's iambic trimeter, we can infer that it's not an original setting. In the case of Orestes, it's very tempting to think it might be original. But that's the only little scrap we have. And in that scrap, there's also some textual issues. The lines are in a slightly different order than we get in the manuscripts. And there's a lot of debate among people who care about this question about whether or not it does respect the pitch accents or not. It does to a certain extent. It clearly deviates from them at points. With that slide I showed that showed the diachronic trends, you can see that things get messier at the end of the 5th century. We also have comments in Plato that suggest that people like Euripides might have been taking some liberties in how they were coordinating words and music, and that the good old music was maybe a little more strict in that. So that could also be something that's going on, especially in Orestes because it's later.
It's surprising, isn't it, how much ancient citation of or copying of other things does take much more liberties with things like line order and word order and things than we would be used to. I mean, even I'm just thinking of places where Plato quotes Homer, and it's clearly not the Homer we have, which is surprising. Just so the sort of point of my question was, I guess, and if there's only one example, then you may have already answered this for the Orestes antistrophe, but how close is the notation, the melody given in the notation in that fragment, to how you would reconstruct it if we didn't have that fragment?
So in some places, it's pretty good. So we've got, there's one of the most dramatic points in that stanza is the chorus sings "Katalo furomai," and the melody notated there is, let's just say, something like the tunings are a little bit different than we might be used to, but using a rough version of a chromatic tuning would be "Katalo furomai, katalo furomai." So it rises up to the accent and then falls after it. But there are some points where it goes exactly against the accentuation. What that means, I think it's the word for mother that has that deviation. Is that actually symbolic? Is that meaningful that you have a distorted mother when you're Orestes talking about Clytemnestra? Could be pointed. There's been some work done on whether that might be pointed as well.
Yeah. Fascinating. Thank you. Katie, did you have anything?
Yeah, I have, in fact, so many questions. Thank you so much, Anna. Just maybe to start with, do you predict that when you look at other genres, as you said you were sort of interested in doing, do you think that you'll find what do you think you'll find, particularly with comedy? Do you think that you're going to, find the same sort of well, relatively consistent data? Are all of Aristophanes' plays going to have sort of statistics in a similar pattern to the tragedies, or do you expect much greater variation in different genres?
What I will say for Aristophanes is I have no idea. And that's kind of an exciting thing because I think it would be interesting. It is, so the plays we have from Aristophanes are in this later 5th century period. And we know that Aristophanes is interested in like modern, new, traditional music. So it seems possible that if there are idiosyncrasies or like weird changes that are happening in music, that he would be making fun of them, and that's going to make it harder to interpret what's going on. If we think about comic songs do a lot of weird things if they're parodying a genre, and it might be hard to figure out what's going on. Of course, if we can find those moments where we can figure out what's going on, one, that will be extremely exciting, but it will also be very valuable for thinking from a critical perspective of how to interpret what we're seeing in tragedy. It's kind of an audience response. So if, for example, you saw archaic songs, so say in frogs, if songs that are meant to be more Aeschylean are somehow more archaic in their melodization, then you could contrast that. Are the parts that are Euripidean less archaic? Do they have a newer sound? Now, the trouble is a lot of Aristophanes' parodies are astrophic, particularly if he is imitating the new music. He's imitating those sung through big climaxes that I can't compare, I can't do accentual responsion for. So it would take a slightly different method to look at those, and that'll be something maybe for down the line. I really wish I could do that one in particular. It'd be so fun.
Yeah, the frogs would for sure be a really, really fascinating for that. In the sorts of other things that you were thinking about investigating in the future, with the capitalized words, so names obviously working slightly differently, what do you expect to see there? Are there any other groups of sort of particular types of words or particular types of phrases that are potentially exceptional for some other reason that you expect to find as well?
Yeah, so it really depends on the difficulty here. Is I think that melody is going to be a consciously created artistic work. It's not like something like where hiatus falls that can maybe be considered unconscious and would sort of change across time. And I think that because of that, how the specific choices that a poet is making in specific places are probably going to be conscious and might not be consistent. Overall, I've found that capitalized words, just whatever's capitalized in our OCT texts, those tend to have lower accentual responsion than words that are not capitalized, suggesting that maybe you would take more liberties in melodically setting a proper name. Or, I mean, that's what we see in the musical documents. The alternative would be that you're more comfortable changing the melody to match a name. That also seems like a valid, like even though you're breaking from the template that you established, that it's still somehow acceptable in the context of a proper name to do that. As regards other words, things that I have found interesting so far is, of course, anything that might involve sound. Can we find a sign of musical word painting? I suggested that a little bit in this use of like a melismatic, lots of circumflex accents when Heracles is talking about this disease that's kind of devouring him, and it's both effeminate, maybe also he talks about his own singing a lot, so maybe he's exaggerating the lyric quality there. You also have instances that I've seen where direct speech seems to also be dense in circumflex accents, which might suggest maybe again a more elaborate vocalization. When the chorus is taking on Agamemnon's voice in the Parados, they use a lot of circumflex accents, especially on key phrases, which of course it's a little tricky. You have a little bit of circular reasoning here. In that particular case, we don't have a lot of exclamations, but if you think about words like oh and foul and I, there's a lot of built-in circumflex accents on exclamations. On the one hand, that's going to raise your rate. On the other hand, it's also going to develop an association of certain kinds of musical patterning with a certain emotional state. So in some ways, it makes it less statistically significant, but it doesn't maybe make it less interpretively relevant when you have a lot of those in a row. Yeah.
Can I come back to names for a second? I'm curious as to whether you said names they took more liberties in or that they were less, they felt the less need to fit the normal responsion, to be as close in terms of. Is that equally true if the proper name is in the strophe or the antistrophe, or is it more in one case or the other? Because there might be slightly different interpretation in those two cases.
I don't think I haven't tested that. It's something I could test, but I'd have to write kind of a different script to go through, and because I have combined syllables tagged and can process those, but then I can also look at the individual tags for the two stanzas, and I was just looking at the combined, so if it's a proper name in either stanza. But that would be an interesting thing to explore. It would maybe give some insight on whether it is that breaking in the antistrophe.
Yes, because I can sort of imagine names you just don't have as much flexibility. You can't say, I'll change this to fit the other thing. A name is what it is, to some extent. So if that would sort of fit if we were seeing this pattern when the name is in the antistrophe. But if we're seeing the name in the strophe, then that's less of a complete explanation, because you could just fit whatever you're putting in the antistrophe to fit around it.
Yeah, I think the premise for looking at capitalized words for me was that in the musical documents that seem to respect accent, they seem to make exceptions actually for proper names. They're not written in responsion, but maybe they want to make a name sound a little bit fancier. So they'll do some sort of melodic fanciness on that word, even though it's not matching the accents. I would say it's less maybe just breaking the accent and more adding elaborations that aren't justified and are technically against the rules.
And you also get this in place names, as you say, as well as.
I would have to go back to the scholarship on this. The examples that I've used most often that are kind of more at hand in my mind are people's names.
And I guess this is a question of editorial practice, but I'm sort of expecting to see, proper adjectives of place names as not being capitalized, unlike in English. And it depends on whether you've got a continental or an English editor producing your OCT, whether or not Athenian has a capital A.
Yeah. One nice thing is that the first words of paragraphs and sentences are not capitalized in the OCT, or else I might just throw it all out. Although actually I might not, because another place where you frequently have exceptions made in the musical documents is at the beginning of utterances.
Right.
You often will start with a strong melodic rise, even if it's not intonationally justified. So maybe I could leave those in anyway. I'll say that's not something that I've used in any of my published work thus far, this question of capitalized words. So it's like one of those places where I did a little fishing expedition like you do, and then didn't really feel like it was necessary to pin down all the fine details. But these are interesting questions that I hope, my hope would be there's more work using this software than I can do. My aim is to have other people hopefully be interested and make use of it in however they feel might be helpful. Like looking at lyric is probably beyond the scope of what I will get to. There's a lot of tragedy to say about it.
This is also a lovely example, isn't it, of these really interesting algorithms giving us new questions rather than necessarily giving us answers. So sometimes they are giving you answers, but sometimes if they're just saying, here are some weird things that we can't explain, now go off and do a study of that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was sort of hijacking your question there, Catherine. Katie, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really interesting point, that using a sort of data-driven approach in this way sort of leads you to ask new questions and think about new things that you wouldn't have done with any other sort of approach. I was going to ask as well, is there anything that sort of like surprised you that was really unexpected when you first started doing the statistics for this? So obviously you showed the example with the Agamemnon where there's one stanza that was really sort of exceptional and stood out from the rest of the play in having much more metrical responsion. Was there any other things that were sort of really surprising that presenting the data in this way allowed you to see?
Mm-hmm. It depends on what I mean by surprising in a way. It's like when you ask me about what I might expect to see in Aristophanes, I really just have no idea. And part of what's going on here is also a process of decoding the data that I'm finding. So at this point, everything is kind of a working hypothesis. So it's really, the Oresteia is one of the plays that I went through first, kind of early on. And so it was looking at those long song sequences, the parados and the komos and koephyri were kind of, for me, really rich places to consider what the patterns that I'm seeing might mean. So if I had those statistics on one side and I have the text and its interpretation on the other side, and I'm going through the two and trying to figure out how these two things fit together, I don't necessarily have an idea going in. There are some places where I'm saying, hey, these things seem to match. That's cool. That might be meaningful. And then there's other places where I might see something in the musical data that doesn't seem necessarily to make sense based on what I'm seeing in the text. So I guess that's surprising, but it's more just a puzzle that suddenly pops up and maybe a problem that I feel like I need to fix. And then what's fun is that usually it seems kind of interpretively significant to me. So in the case of the Agamemnon parados, there are two places where there's a shift in the structure of the narrative between a strophe and an antistrophe. So near the beginning of the song, you have the hymn to Zeus, which is 3 stanzas long. It's a strophe, an antistrophe, and a strophe. Then you cut back to the Aulis narrative, this discussion of Agamemnon and the troops and Aulis and their bad winds and him making the decision to kill his daughter. But that stanza responds to the final stanza of the hymn to Zeus. It has the same music. And this is the one that I showed you, that has this exceptionally high responsion, or I should say high accentual responsion. I've found some that are just almost perfect throughout in more climactic positions in plays. But what that says to me is that the music, this isn't a situation where there were going to be a lot of changes between the two, or where you weren't going to really hear the echo, where we're just continuing along. It's a place where they're really emphatically paired. Maybe driving home a comparison that you wouldn't see, it would feel like a transition, but the music is emphatically barring that transition. And then you have a similar effect at the very end of that song, where they sing the last description of well, actually what they end with is reminiscing about Iphigenia singing for her father. A passage with like a lot of circumflexes, seems very musically elaborate. Maybe they're kind of evoking her song, but it responds to them talking about what seems to be Clytemnestra entering. And there's something kind of ominous about that to me. It's one of the big puzzles for me, because those passages are almost almost perfectly accentually compatible, almost identical. And what that means musically is very puzzling to me. It's almost like the antistrophe has become a metaphor, that we had Iphigenia as a strophe, and here is Clytemnestra, her antistrophe. So we're going to get the punishment for the backstory that is preceded. So that's kind of surprising. I don't know if it's not, I didn't have a preconception, but it's finding cool stuff is maybe how I would describe it.
So again, just to sort of an aside on that question, how much much do we think? And I just wonder if there's any common, comparisons to study people have done on opera or other musical things where we have the audience, as it were. How much do we think people noticed that your statistics has caused us to notice, but how much do you think the audience noticed that?
I haven't looked. I've looked into musicological data more on the methods side for thinking about, coordinating accent and melody, how that's done, how it's regarded. And then I've looked at some specific contours, like, rising melodies have certain emotional associations, falling melodies have different emotional associations. But I'm not sure about, I'm trying to think about what exactly I'd be looking for there. Like that more melodic movement leads to some, I'm not sure exactly what I'd be looking at, but it seems like the premise of a lot of music theory would be that music is meaningful.
Yeah, exactly. And therefore it has to be, But it's got to be largely unconscious, I think. I mean, I couldn't tell you the difference between a major key and a minor key, but when something shifts to minor key to make it ominous, I can feel that it's ominous, right? I mean, so that sort of thing, and the same must be true with the circumflexes and things like that. That people couldn't necessarily tell you that what was going on, but that they would feel something going on. Yeah. I just wonder about actual echoes of responsion from 10 lines ago, how much we think. I mean, does that sort of echoing go on in opera or in country music or something? I bet it does. But
yeah, I mean, in the context of opera, we could definitely look at like motifs, right? That you could have a leitmotif that gets associated with a certain idea, shows up later. Those tend to, like when we think about that kind of model, it tends to be multiple repetitions. And then it's a shorter thing and it's more widespread. One example, so this is not outside scholarship, although I'm drawing somewhat on it, is looking at a few Cole Porter songs. I kind of went on a tangent in my dissertation, did some Cole Porter. But if you think about really clever lyricists who are also writing their own music, so they're really crafting this as a whole, the same way that the ancient poets would be. In a comic song, you often have this sort of as a punchline, right? If you think about what the first stanza, the first verse, we would say, does, is it establishes certain expectations and to a certain extent associations. But there's a rhyme scheme, there's a certain type of melodization, and then when you repeat that in the next verse, you have expectations, and when you want to get that punchline to land, what's really key in making the punchline land is you have to have exactly the pattern that the audience was expecting. You have to have that sense of match. But then you also, I noticed it has to really match the wording. So the lyrics, it can't just be any melody. The melody has to be carefully coordinated to the wording, or else it doesn't sound as clever, right? That's a different kind of context. It's humor, it's self-consciously clever. It's a different effect, but it shows to me that an audience can, like if they're playing with that audience response and using it meaningfully, it must be something that audiences are doing, even in modern songs.
Just keeping an eye on the chat box, but as we don't have any current live questions, I suspect questions are more likely to come via email, as we've got probably a larger asynchronous audience. So hi to the asynchronous audience. So maybe we, unless anyone has a very, very urgent last short question, maybe we could break here. Thank Anna once again for the seminar. I mean, it's always a bit surreal to do this when we're in a Zoom, in a video call rather than in a room. But I think yes, thank you very much. And yes, to the audience, I hope you'll join us next week for and the next 2 weeks, in fact, for the next couple of seminars. Next week we have Naomi Scott from Bristol talking about crowdsourcing a translation of Julius Pollux, and the week after we have Valentina Janacev from the University of Florence talking about matching fragments of Egyptian papyri using AI. So please do come along for either of those. For those two, if you happen to be in London, you can also come along in person. Thank you all very much, and bye-bye.